Here's a segment from a recent Gun Talk radio episode. You can listen to all the Gun Talk radio podcasts however you tune in, or check out guntalk.com for more. We have been talking, if you've listened at all, we talk about defensive gun uses, and there's been a lot of discussion about how many times do people actually use guns in self-defense. It's one of those demarcation points where the folks who don't like guns or want to ban guns, they say, well, it hardly ever happens. Well, let's talk to somebody who actually knows this stuff. Bringing in right now Dave Kopel. He is the research director at the Independence Institute, also connected, Dave, with Cato as well, as I remember.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So we try to use the various studies out there, and there are a lot of them, of how many times do people use guns in self-defense. We had John Lott's book, The Bias Against Guns. He talked about that, the fact that so often self-defense gun uses don't get reported in the news, leaving the public with the impression that it hardly ever happens. Is that fair?
That's true, and it's also true that defensive gun uses, to the extent they do make the news, tend to be a local story and not a national one. As you say, there's a lot of numbers on defensive gun use, and the most recent best estimate is about 1.6 million annually. Most of the serious scholars who've looked at it said, well, whatever the uncertainties, it's at least several 100,000 a year.
Okay, so the lowest number we see is several 100,000, and I have seen numbers that go as high as 3 million times a year. That's a big
right.
gap. Why do we have that big of a gap?
It's partly because of how you have to go look at the evidence. So let's say the homicide results in a corpse, which is difficult to hide.
And you can count that.
Exactly. So that's the easiest thing. I think one of the problems is some defensive gun uses are going to be reported. Some people are breaking into your house and you fire 7 shots at the criminals and stop them, and that kind of noise is going to come to the attention of other people in the neighborhood.
Makes sense.
Likely, and the police will come and look at it. On the other hand, if you're walking down the street, you're a woman and coming home after work in the dark, and 3 people come up and start menacing you, you refer to your handgun or you pull it out of the compartment in your purse, and they run away. Do you have an incentive to call the police and tell them about that?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Maybe you'll be the one who the police, they got to arrest somebody, and then you get in trouble for that, and you'll beat the rap eventually, but after a few $100,000 in legal fees.
A lot of defensive gun uses are not reported. And the other part of it is, and this is your article, How Often Do Armed Citizens Defend Themselves, in the NRA's official journal, a good article. One of the things that happens is that most of the time people defend themselves with guns and they do not have to actually shoot someone.
Yes, we're fairly consistent that at least 80% of defensive gun uses don't involve a shot being fired.
Do you have any idea how many studies have been done on this through the years? Got to be a dozen at least, I would think.
Oh, at least a dozen. The way this started out was back in the 1970s. The Field poll is a well-known California pollster. Asked people about defensive gun use, extrapolated up to a national number that would lead to several 100,000 or more annually. Actually, over the years of the late 70s to the early 90s, there were probably over a dozen national pollsters, Gallup, those kind of companies, Terrence Hart, that asked questions, and they came in within a range, but all at a very high number of hundreds of thousands up into the millions. And then we get into the area of the more sophisticated academic studies. Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz did a very famous one. The Centers for Disease Control actually did a couple as well.
There's a story.
The Police Foundation, which is a think tank for big city police chiefs, had 2 very good scholars do one. Then what we've got most recently is William English, who's a professor at Georgetown.
Right.
Did a major national study, and that's where we've got the best, most recent data, which gets us the 1.6 million estimate.
The CDC studies on this, I think a couple of them. You might just talk about what happened there. Is it going too far to say they just buried this?
Well, they sure didn't put it out front and center. So we got 2 different things. One is, the CDC back in the 90s was giving out lots of grants for gun control research. And one they did was, how often are guns used against home invasion burglars? It was just on that. and it was conducted by random telephone dialing around the country. That study, which was published in a scholarly journal, said that's about 600,000 times a year. And the author said this was, as the CDC grant requires, in the first footnote, this was funded by a grant from the Centers for Disease Control. It came out, and the CDC has an enormous publicity machine, and they did not turn it on for this one. They turned it on in that same general time period for some lower quality studies, which were anti-gun and said, guns are too dangerous for normal Americans.
I mean, come on. They didn't like the results of the study that people actually use guns to protect themselves. So they didn't, once they had the survey and the information, the study, they just said, we're just not going to tell anybody about it.
Well, right, and then the author, who is a professor, has a separate incentive structure, did publish it, but it got very little media attention. Separately from that, the CDC does these annual behavioral risk surveys nationally. And in the late 90s, they had given, and they're done in cooperation with the individual states. And so they, in the late 90s, added an optional question about defensive gun use in general. Based on extrapolations from that state data, you would get something over 1 million defensive gun uses a year. They did not call attention to that.
Again, hid that because they didn't like it. The other one, and
that actually got leaked 2 decades later.
Right, 2 decades later. The one that I really liked, before I have to hit the break here, is one that was done by Cook and Ludwig, where they said, this number of 2.5 million defensive gun uses can't be right. Cook and Ludwig, very well known and pretty much anti-gun researchers. I can say that. You may not want to say that.
Yes, but respected guys, not they're not hacks like some others are.
Yes, exactly. And they came out with, they said, we're going to prove that this is wrong, and using much the same methodology that Lott did in Click. As I remember it, it's been a while since I've read this, but as I remember it, they came up, they said, it turned out it's not actually 2.5 million. They came up with 3 million, and then they spent the next 2 pages of their own study explaining why their numbers can't be believed. It was the weirdest thing.
Well, right. So this is it's Philip Cook and Jens Ludwig, Guns in America, Results of a Comprehensive National Survey of Firearms Ownership and Use, published in 1996. And they said there was a range, because data has this uncertainty. But their midpoint estimate was 1.46 million annually. Their survey built on the Kleck and Gertz survey from a few years earlier. But Cook and Ludwig had said, well, this survey has this problem and that problem, so we're going to fix it, and now we're going to do everything perfectly and right. And that this is the result they got. And Cook and Ludwig then said, you know what? It's actually impossible to measure defensive gun use. They hadn't thought that when the survey began, but at the end they said, no, it just can't be done.
That's right. We don't like what we've come up with our own research, so we're going to say it's actually impossible to measure this. Oh, look.
Yeah, but to their credit, they did publish the research.
They did put it out, yes.
And they put it all out there, and then people can read what they said and agree or disagree with their argument about why it's impossible to measure defensive gun use.
Terrific. Thank you so much for this article, the How Often Do Armed Citizens Defend Themselves? It's in the NRA's official journal. Dave Kopel, thank you for your time, and I appreciate all of your efforts on the behalf of preserving the Constitution and specifically the Second Amendment.
Thanks, and right back at you. I mean, Gun Talk has just been a fantastic resource for the preservation of our country's basic liberties ever since you got started 3 decades ago, I guess.
And you've been part of it all along the way, and I count on you and actually tap into your knowledge often, sometimes off the air, just to get some background when I don't understand stuff, which is very often, actually. Dave Kopel, thank you so much, sir.